Now for some analysis from our political panel. Susan Page is U.S. Today's Washington bureau chief. Mark Leibovich is the chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine. Robert Costa is a national political reporter for the Washington Post. And Reihan Salam is the executive editor of the National Review. Welcome to all of you. Susan, let's start with Benghazi. Susan, give us your bottom line after all of this, politically, how this shook out.
You know, I think Hillary Clinton survived, did no harm. After a pretty good 10-day period where she was good in the debate and where Joe Biden decided not to run, she didn't provide the kind of moment or the kind of information that could create big problems for her down the road. And I think that's the best that she could have expected.
Mark, you wrote about Hillary Clinton's campaign and her effort to show authenticity, or what passes for it in a presidential campaign. What did you make of just the theater review of this?
Well, I mean, look, I think she is almost at her best when she is under siege in a weird way, and when she has a compelling contrast, which the Republicans on the committee certainly provided. She's been able to perform very, very well. She puts herself into good definition with Democratic voters. I think all of that will probably be the most lasting takeaway from that.
Robert, Hillary Clinton had her back up against the wall, but so did the chairman of this committee, Trey Gowdy, because of the comments of his own Republican Party. It made him so frustrated. How did the Republicans come out at the end of this day of hearing?
Instead of spending the day at the committee hearing room, I was outside of the Republican cloakroom. And a lot of House Republicans were frustrated. They thought they ruined their opportunity politically because of the comments made by Kevin McCarthy. And they feel like it was a wash. Some of them got some moments in the spotlight that they can go back to their districts and say they took on Clinton. But in terms of making it a moment for 2016 that's going to be remembered, they shrugged it off and said they didn't accomplish what they sought to.
Ram, what's your view of the kind of larger significance of what was missed here?
So Secretary Clinton is very eager to take credit for the NATO intervention in Libya. She played a big role in that. Libya is in a civil war. It is radiating crisis throughout North Africa. It was the spark of the refugee crisis we're still dealing with. The country is paralyzed in the region. That's what we should be debating. What was the logic of this intervention? What has come of it? And what have you learned from the experience?
None of which was discussed in that hearing. I think that's right. Let's talk about Joe Biden, who decided not to run for president this week. Mark, he's gone on his way out of the campaign that he never joined. He made a plea for bipartisanship, said Republicans are not the enemy. Will that be picked up as the standard for one of the Democratic candidates, or is that?
Probably not. I actually think if you're Hillary Clinton and you hear that, I mean, you sort of have to take it a little personally, given that her answer in the Democratic debate was that she saw Republicans as her enemy, which I thought was actually a bad moment for her, and I think it's something that, you know, might come back to haunt her at some point. But no, look, I thought it was a nice conciliatory way to get out. I thought it was gracious. I think it's the right decision, and look, I think that people are, you know, Hillary Clinton's probably very happy that he's not running.
Yeah, Susan, what did you make of Bernie Sanders at the Jefferson Jackson dinner? As Nancy Cordes reported, he's turning up the rheostat on the attacks on Hillary Clinton. It's not a full frontal, but it's different than we've seen from him before.
Definitely a new phase of the campaign for Bernie Sanders. I mean, this was much more critical than he's been before. And drawing the contrast with he's made good decisions that have stood the test of time on things like trade and gay marriage and Wall Street, and she's had to reverse herself on a series of these issues. You know, we're also looking for him to do a big speech on what it means to be a socialist, which is something I think he's been reluctant to do. His advisors have told him he needs to do this in the same way that Barack Obama did a speech on race, or that John Kennedy did a speech on religion.
It was a key speech, though, at that Jefferson Jackson dinner for Sanders. You saw Sanders introduce his life story, his career. It wasn't just railing against the banks. I think that speech is going to be remembered, if Sanders gets the nomination or close to it, as a turning point where he introduced himself to Democratic voters in a fresh way.
Because it rounds out his...
It rounds out. It's the full Bernie Sanders. He's not just someone who's taken a hammer to the banks. He's someone who's had a long career. He detailed his battles. It was more personal than we've seen before.
Ram, what do you make of this speech on explaining socialism, trying to get this idea across, in other words, presumably because he's worried that that word is kind of can be toxic politically?
I think that when you're looking at his case for socialism, for democratic socialism, the really key question is this. We've seen in Northern democracy societies that have embraced, you know, systems that Bernie Sanders really likes. They are built on high middle-class taxes. That's fair enough. You know, it seems to work for them okay. Are American middle-class voters going to embrace that? That's the speech he needs to give. And if he wants to own up to that, and if he wants to run an election, if the Democrats want to run an election, on the idea that we need much higher middle-class taxes. They're very welcome to do so. But that's the piece that's been missing. People keep dodging that issue that if you want way more expensive public services, if you want to be very generous in these ways, someone has to pay for it, and it can't just be the top 1%.
So it's a math problem, not a labels problem.
Yeah, exactly. Call it what you want.
See, I think that I think socialism is potentially very toxic for him. I think that he's probably made a very, very careful calculation that this is something probably to avoid, and I think that's why he probably turned some of the attention to Hillary Clinton last night in his speech, and in many ways was sort of aligning himself with Barack Obama, looking back at things like Iraq, looking back at gay marriage. Sort of drawing a contrast that Barack Obama was able to do very effectively in 2007 and 2008 in Iowa.
But when Barack Obama was able to do that in 2007 and 8, he was able to say, policies in the future won't be handled well by Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders attacked her on LGBT issues, but she's kind of in the right place on those issues now. Is there a lot of extra territory that he'll say, look, I'll be this much better on those issues than Hillary Clinton would be?
So he's a victim of his own success,
yeah,
because his challenge has succeeded in moving Hillary Clinton to the left on some of the issues that he has been most identified with. I think he can make the case that he actually believes what he's saying, and that when questions come up, you can trust him. This is a case that Bernie Sanders is trying to make. When questions come up, you can trust him to make the right decision off the start, and to not be swayed by what's going to be politically convenient. Now, does that work? I don't think there is, in fact, a huge amount of policy difference between these two candidates at this point.
Right. Okay. We're going to switch over to the Republicans, but let's take a break real quick so we don't chop that up too much. Stay with us. We'll be right back in a moment. We're back with more from our political panel. Reihan, I want to start with you. In the House, Republicans, looks like Paul Ryan is going to be the new speaker against his wishes. How much will things change?
Well, I think the key question is, do Republicans trust him? Do they believe that his heart is in the right place? Are they willing to follow him? Because even if he makes a pragmatic accommodation here or there, they ultimately believe he wants to take them in the right direction. And I think for right now, he seems to have won a lot of goodwill. So I think that that's an encouraging sign. But to some degree, he just wants to prevent this group from descending into chaos. And I think that he has a decent shot at doing that.
Robert, how did this come about? Paul Ryan didn't want the job. There were a lot of people on the kind of ultra right wing of this party that were saying we don't like Paul Ryan for these reasons, but now he's got it. It looks, pretty sewn up for him.
He has built political capital over the past decade, being the budget man, being a leader within the House of Representatives, friendly with the right, but also friendly with the leadership, so that when McCarthy fell and the hard right didn't have a candidate, didn't have a strategy. Reihan was standing there as really the lone person who could ascend. And so he moves into this job reluctantly, but he's also trying to maneuver so he can keep the House functioning. He just hired David Hoppe, a longtime Capitol Hill operator, to be his chief of staff. An important hire because he's an insider, but he also used to be Jack Kemp's chief of staff, is seen as a movement conservative. So we're watching Reihan thread the needle even before he gets the gavel.
Susan, Paul Ryan said he wanted to spend time with his family, not do so much time fundraising. But isn't fundraising by the speaker one of the last levers a speaker has? In other words, with a member, they can say, look, I want you on this to be with me on this vote, and I'll visit your hometown and do 2 fundraisers for you. If Paul Ryan isn't going to do that, isn't he taking away some of his own leverage?
I think that's right. It's one of the most important things that the speaker does. And it's, as you say, it's one of the chits he can play with members, and it's not something you can delegate. You know, the number 2 in command, the number 3 in command, it's just not the same having that person come into your district as opposed to the speaker, who is, of course, 3rd in line to the presidency and has a certain distinctive stature.
Although he could take the kids on the fundraising, there's nothing more exciting than a fundraiser, those crudité. Mark, I want to switch to the presidential race here and talk to you about Donald Trump and Ben Carson. Donald Trump says he's a counterpuncher. Doesn't punch until he's hit. But Ben Carson drives around the block to keep from hitting Donald Trump, and yet Donald Trump is now on him on a variety of things.
I think Donald Trump would say that he has been hit by Ben Carson, given that Ben Carson has caught him in the polls in Iowa. So maybe he considers that a punch of some kind. Look, I don't think Donald Trump knows exactly how he wants to deal with Ben Carson yet. I thought the Seventh-day Adventist remark was kind of curious. I mean, I just don't know about them. I thought that might have been a proxy for him basically saying, you know, what's the deal with this guy? Which I think is kind of a whisper in question that I think a lot of people who have been watching him in debates have wondered. I mean, he's a very unknown candidate. You know, I think Trump is probably trying to cast some questions or raise some questions.
I actually think that was directly aimed at evangelical voters in Iowa. You know, evangelicals make up 57% of Republican caucus goers, and by 2 to 1, they favor Carson over Trump at this point in your own poll, in the poll that you put out today. So by raising questions about Seventh-day Adventists and encouraging evangelicals to take a look at this religion, maybe they don't know as much about it either, is a way for him to make inroads among what might be the most important voting bloc in the Republican caucuses.
You take a look at the relationship and take a step back. It's fascinating. We're in late October, and these 2 outsiders, amateur politicians, are dominating the Republican race. And in the Washington Post today, we take a look at this relationship. Just a few weeks ago, Trump was talking about putting Carson potentially on the ticket, but now because Carson's caught up, as you said, Trump's going right at him.
Reihan, what do you make of, we've seen Donald Trump do well, but we've also seen consistent polls. We have another one here that shows a high number of people who would be unsatisfied with him. That number for Ben Carson is quite low. So does Ben Carson have lots and lots of room to grow in the Republican field here, or does he have his own challenges?
I am a little skeptical because I believe that he is occupying that Santorum lane, that Robertson lane of being the kind of evangelical candidate, and I think that it's going to be difficult for him to grow beyond that. What I do think is interesting is this. Both in the kind of intra-Republican fight in the House and in the presidential race, the real cleavage is between those who are taking a kind of anti-immigration stance, which resonates with large numbers of party members, and those who are taking a pro-immigration stance. If you're looking at those establishment candidates, which one of them will try to come to a synthesis, try to move away from that Wall Street Journal editorial page kind of donor class position, more in the direction of the populist position on immigration that resonates with the base? The candidate who's going to do that is going to rise in the polls.
Speaking of rising or not rising, as the case may be, the synthesis immigration candidate at one time was Jeb Bush. Of course, it was also at one time Marco Rubio. But Jeb Bush in particular has had a pretty bad week, had to cut his staff. We saw that comment earlier in the show from him, a sense of sort of irritation. Where do you think the Bush campaign is, Susan?
Looked pretty peevish, I thought, in the clip that you showed. He's in the 3 important states you polled. He's in single digits in all of them. The most important number might be the 57% of Iowa Republicans who say they would be dissatisfied with him as a candidate. And you contrast that with Marco Rubio, who is second most acceptable after Ben Carson. Only 27% of Iowa Republicans said he'd be unacceptable. Talk about room to grow. This is really fueling, I think, the sense that Marco Rubio is the candidate to watch if there's going to be an alternative who has actually held office before for this nomination.
Yeah, and so you have the 2 former Florida friends may not become very friendly. Thanks all of you very much. Stay with us.